Don't any of you have the guts to play for blood?
I'm your huckleberry. That's just my game.
Today on MythVision, we are joined by Dr. James F. McGrath, a distinguished New Testament scholar and historian of early Christianity. Dr. McGrath is the Clarence L. Goodwin Chair in New Testament Language and Literature at Butler University, and he is widely recognized for his work on the historical Jesus, Christian origins, and the intersections between the Bible and science fiction. We'll be discussing his groundbreaking new book. I hope my audio is coming through clean. Can you hear me pretty well here, everybody? Hope it's going all right. Anyway, we're going to be discussing his groundbreaking new book, John of History, Baptist of Faith, The Quest for the Historical Baptizer. In this work, Dr. McGrath peels back the layers of tradition to uncover the historical figure of John the Baptist, arguably one of the most influential yet misunderstood figures in early Christianity. The book explores John's distinctive practice of baptism, his impact on Jesus, and his surprising legacy and movements as diverse as Christianity, Gnosticism, and even the Mandeans. Dr. McGrath shows us why John deserves far more than a passing mention as merely the forerunner of Jesus. He challenges us to recognize John as a religious innovator in his own right, one whose influence shaped entire traditions across centuries. It's an honor to welcome Dr. James F. McGrath to MythVision. Welcome back, my friend.
Derek, thank you for having me back. So good to see you. So good to be here. I want to apologize to everybody who is waiting and offer them the same apology that I offered to you. Now, somebody just commented, well, I guess McGrath is not here, which is funny. Yeah. Yeah, it's been a rough start of the semester. Air conditioning unit flooded in my office. Flooded is an exaggeration, but wet carpet and bookshelves that were covered in mold. And for people who like you and I and a lot of the people who listen to your show who love books, the books are safe, but it was chaos, and I was not paying attention to pop-up reminders and messages and stuff. So
we're gonna blame you and possibly forgive you. Okay, we'll consider if we'll forgive you over the coming years. I mean, this is kind of almost an unforgivable sin. So no, actually, I do it all the time, and so don't let me be the hypocrite pointing at the little speck in your eye, and I've got the plank in mine. So you're here. I think that's what matters the most, and we get your time. And we can be educated by what you are producing here in this book. If you don't mind, is there anything you want to say before I start asking questions?
No. Lots of delay of the second coming jokes come to mind, stuff like that. But let's just get into John the Baptist. Better than
I could see.
We'll keep it to John the Baptist jokes for this one.
There you go. Look, get the hardcover if you like harder books like I do. But then again, paperback's fine too. I hope everybody will go in the description. The link is there. I have an Amazon affiliate link there. Helps me put a little gasoline at the end of the month in the car for all the people who do buy books through MythVision's Amazon affiliate link. So why titled? Why the title? Okay, what's going on here?
Yeah, and some people know immediately, and some people will be like, what the heck is with that title? And I know you're in the former category, but thank you for asking so that I can explain it for everyone else. It's a title that got puzzled looks from people outside of my field and immediate laughs from people in my field. So there's this long-standing phrase that we've used in historical Jesus study, talking about the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith, right? And contrasting them over and against one another, right? The Christ of faith is this figure who is the object of devotion and theology and creedal statements and surrounded and shrouded in all this stuff. And the Jesus of history is this figure that we try to get back to and often have to dig through the Christ of faith in an attempt to recover and catch a glimpse of that figure. And so given that I want to work on the figure of John and was going to have to do something similar because John is depicted in ways that are not at all unbiased, both in sources that like him and in sources that are like him but want to downplay his influence. And so thought I'd play on that famous phrase and came up with John of history, Baptist of faith. And I'll be honest, somebody, I love puns, and I have more punny book titles and chapter titles than I'll ever have time to write, probably. But I was really surprised that nobody had used this before, right? And so that just astonished me.
That's what's interesting is you've got right at the opening of the sleeve, the first study of its kind. So it seems interesting because I'm like, everybody's done the historical Jesus. I mean, come on. What about the historical John the Baptist? So this leads to my first question that I feel like this is the real first question. It's kind of like the problem we have for historical Jesus studies often, and you know this quite well, is that we're dealing with the fan fiction. And I call it fan fiction. These are the fans, okay? So you're going to get a perspective, whether you as an academic or critical accepts this as historical or thinks this might have been a later redactor, someone who in the name of or whatever, because we know the Gospels do play games with earlier material doing their own agenda with that particular theological position or whatever. But with John the Baptist, I feel like we're at a more fortunate position. It feels at least a little bit that Josephus gets to mention this dude. And I know we get these mentions from Jesus, highly disputed sometimes, clearly the testimonium, the other one, not as much. But when we're talking about John the Baptist, I think we're entering a different arena where I don't think there's many interpolation hypotheses trying to explain why Herod is getting this guy killed and how that is really different from the Gospels. So is it easier to differentiate between the Baptist of history or John of history?
Yeah, I think he was a baptizer. So yeah, it's a false dichotomy. Right. John the Baptist of history and whatever else of faith would just not have been as catchy. So we've discovered that my title is at least somewhat flawed when you pay too much attention to it. So I don't think that that Josephus was necessarily giving us John as he really was, while the gospel authors and the Mandaeans are biased but in opposing ways. Josephus seems very adamant that John's baptism was not for the forgiveness of sins. Sounds like somebody in Josephus's time thought that it was, and so why Josephus would have held that view, it might be what John thought. It might have just been the sort of thing that was emphasized, probably by priests, at least reputable priests, about sacrifice, that the sacrifice is not what forgives you, right? It's your attitude, your inner attitude has to be right for the ritual to work. I imagine that John himself did say something like that, but that ultimately he was offering a baptism that was for the forgiveness of sin. And it may be that the Gospels were trying to get at that too when they said a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And so it's like, you can't just do the thing and then go back to doing the same old stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I just figured if a lot of people would be questioning what the Gospels are doing, whether there was a guy or not, that's not up for really debate. Usually people are all, even mythicists, are full on the side of saying this guy existed, right? So once we've already granted that, then it becomes like, what do we know about that guy, right? And so I guess this gets into my follow-up question, that is, many scholars note that Q contains a Baptist tendency. What does the prominence of John the Baptist in Q reveal about the early Jesus movement? And how do you feel about Q as far as this is concerned? I mean, I know you're a little biased when it comes to John the Baptist. You like but what's your position?
Well, both as a New Testament scholar and as a fan of Star Trek and of James Bond, I love Q in all the various forms of Q. But when it comes to the New Testament source, I mean, I'm inclined to think that there was some sort of common source that Matthew and Luke used. That just seems to be much more likely than that. That Luke, either that Luke scattered Matthew's nicely organized, discourses, or that it seems like the easiest explanation for the fact that sometimes Matthew's version of a saying that we attribute to Q seems more original, more authentic, and Luke seems to have done something to it, and sometimes the reverse, right? And so if they're both working from a common source, then we can explain that, right? And we see the same thing with their use of Mark. Ultimately, I'm not wedded to it dogmatically. I think it would be a mistake to be. I just find it makes good sense to me. But if there was a Q source, then as we start to see it peeking through in the Gospels of Luke and Matthew, it starts with John the Baptist and his baptism. And then it comes back to him sort of in the middle. And the teaching of Jesus, the teaching attributed to Jesus in Q, sounds so much like it would fit on the lips of John that New Testament scholar Claire Rothschild has actually written a book suggesting that the Q source was originally a collection of John the Baptist sayings that was then reworked and turned into a Jesus source. And I think she's right that there's a focus on John the Baptist. I don't think we need to attribute it to having originally been a collection of John's sayings to make sense of that. I think that Q was probably about Jesus as the one who's basically taking over leadership of the John movement, and whether he is fulfilling John's expectations and whether John's followers should become Jesus' followers.
This is a mess, right? And I love this because I like messes, and I also like mysteries, and I also love puzzles that you can't really ever solve, but you can get closer and you feel like you're getting warm. So the next question is kind of John as central to the shaping of Q, if this is some bedrock source, right? Like you said, but you kind of hinted at this. Like, if that is the case, were those sayings incorporated later from Baptist circles? Or do we find some of these sayings in Baptist circles?
Yeah, so you mentioned a group, and this is maybe the place to work them in. You mentioned the Mandaeans, and people who watch your show, I mean, they got to know who these people are, right? But there may be one or two who missed that episode, or didn't catch them in some discussion. But this is a group that is essentially the last surviving Gnostic group to make it down to the present day, and they differ. They're in a lot of ways, they're a lot like. I mean, it's the same religion that we find in sources that we found at Nag Hammadi, like the Apocryphon of John or Secret Gospel of John. What's different is that the Nag Hammadi texts, the so-called Gnostic Gospels, for those who aren't familiar with the place they were found, usually they either like Jesus a lot or they don't mention him and aren't really interested. What the Mandaeans have that's really distinctive is they don't like Jesus. They love John. They think John was a Mandaean. He was a prophet who was proclaiming their message and teaching baptism. And Jesus they view as a disciple of John's who went off the rails. Right? He basically distorted John's teaching. And so the question whether we have material preserved in Baptist circles, I think is one that we need to approach from a number of angles. Right? On the one hand, we have these texts from this tradition, but when are they from? How late are they? We need to ask those kinds of questions. On the other hand, I think in a very real sense, some of our earliest Christian texts, or texts that we would call Christian, right? Some of them weren't even using the term yet, were aware that they were part of the Baptist movement, right? And they were just this one branch of it that thought that Jesus fulfills John's proclamation and expectations and sort of exceeds them and should become the focus now. But in a real sense, all of this is the Baptist movement. And that's one of the reasons why I think that our failure to put it in those terms and to think of Josephus' teacher Magus as probably impacted by John the Baptist, and Gnosticism as something that emerges in the circles around John, and Christianity is something that emerges in the circles around John. And so basically, John is the center of the vibrant, diverse religious creativity that's happening in the first century. And he doesn't get credit for that.
That's the unfortunate part, right? In your book, you argue that John the Baptist was not just another purity immersion, but some, or his baptism, sorry, was not like just a basic purity immersion, but something distinctive, even controversial in his time. What makes it so unique? And just to show people an example, there are there's literally, I'd say 1,000 probably. There's probably more than 1,000 all across the Levant during this transitional period in the Common Era. Like, Jews were having ritual immersion baths everywhere. I've seen them in Qumran. I've seen them all the way in the north, in the Galilee. I mean, they're everywhere. This particular one is in the Galilee, right off of the sea. I believe this is the one. Maybe I got the wrong image, but it's right there near Magdala. So you got this interesting church right now on the lake. But this is everywhere. Why? If this is everywhere, right? This is the question. Then James, how the heck could he be so unique? What's he doing? Everybody's taking a bath, right?
Right. Well, I think that's precisely how we realize that John was unique, right? Because if you have a country where everybody's eating pizza, I mean, you're gonna have to do something really, really distinctive that stands out to get the nickname Derek the Pizza Eater, right? I mean, it's just not gonna happen, right? If I leave New York City, and live somewhere else, then I might get the nickname James the New Yorker, right? Because then I'm sort of the odd one out. When everybody's immersing, how does John become known as the immerser? How does that become his nickname? And what does that nickname mean in a context in which everybody's doing this? And so that's one reason why I think that John's immersion must have had a different significance. The other is what we talked about, that the sources do hint or explicitly say that it was about forgiveness, not merely removal of ritual impurity. And then in the New Testament, we have a depiction, and it doesn't need to be a depiction of an actual historical event. It may reflect nonetheless the impression that these early authors had of what was historically plausible, right? And being close in time to the event and to John's baptism, it's still relevant, even if they're not describing an actual literal event that happened. But they depict controversy, right? People, for instance, in the Gospel of John, Jewish leaders coming to John and saying, who are you that you're doing these things? Are you the Christ? Are you Elijah? Are you, the prophet? And John denies that he's these various things. Whether that's historical is very seriously doubtful, but that's another matter. But the fact that they're saying, then how can you baptize, right? And if he's doing ritual immersion for purity, then you don't need any special authority. You don't need to be the prophet or Elijah or something like that in order to do this. And if you have a different view of purity immersion in some way, well, there was a lot of that too, right? The folks at Qumran were doing something a bit different than the Pharisees were doing. And so the impression we get is that these early Christian authors understood John to have been doing something that required special authority. And that means that his baptism was something distinct from the kinds of bathing and purity immersions that everybody was doing.
Is it also safe to say there's some potentially historical conflict between temple, purity, that there's the temple that's necessary versus the coming out here into the wilderness? Again, it's almost like Genesis in a sense. I mean, maybe this is theological, but I'm just thinking in the sense that what if there was some movement behind this that was doing this in light of the fact that in Genesis, theologically, going to the temple, building a tower, there's this kind of like go to civilization. That's actually the bad thing to do. The good thing is the wilderness. It's to get out to the wilderness and get away from. I'm kind of wondering if that played a role. It leads into my question here too, and that is, do you think he had biblical inspirations like Samuel or Isaiah? Because you explore these possibilities for his practice. Which of these do you think best captures his theological innovation? So maybe temple controversy with what he's doing, maybe Genesis, get away from Tower of Babel kind of stuff, maybe Samuel, Isaiah. I mean, what do you think? Yeah.
So there's such a tangled web of questions we could ask about John, and I'm going to put aside for the moment the questions about John's own possible ancestry as a descendant of a priest, and so somebody who in theory could have been serving in the temple and yet is offering forgiveness without having to pay for animal sacrifice and without the temple, which itself is really interesting, right? I remember at one point, thinking, but with a bit of frustration, that it would be, if only I could have been a fly on the wall and seen, with the father-son arguments, if that was in fact John's background. But in terms of the sources of inspiration, there are definitely some biblical ones that we can look at. And in terms of some of the possible extra-biblical developments that might have served as inspiration, there are some things that we don't know or when they're composed, but that are just really intriguing in terms of similarities of symbolism. The one that came to mind when you mentioned Genesis is one that's known as the Life of Adam and Eve, right? And there's some variations on it. But one of the features is that Adam and Eve, having been cast out of Eden because of their sin, they stand up to their necks in water, right, in the flowing rivers, right, the Jordan, in order to seek forgiveness, right, as a sort of a penance. And so the question whether that reflects John's influence, or is that something that somebody had written and then John took up that idea? One of the fascinating questions that I don't claim to have answered in the book, but that I feel like we ought to spend more time on.
What about the Exodus, with just the concept of Israel needs to go through the waters? This kind of idea of getting away from the slavery or imprisonment of sin, or this Roman/Jewish collaborative effort of the temple that they're seeing, and they're saying, hey, we're getting away from this. I don't know. I'm just thinking in some way that might play a role. What are your thoughts? Yeah,
possibly. So, I mean, and it's like the Murder on the Orient Express, right? Where there's just too many possible possible suspects, right? And so maybe it was all of them for John, right? I don't know that he could have. I don't see any reason why he couldn't have seen what he was doing as symbolizing a second Exodus, right? Bring the people out of exile through repentance and passing through the waters to become a renewed people of God, and yet also perhaps have seen in Isaiah, the early chapters of Isaiah, because of course the second half of Isaiah, sort of from chapter 40 onwards, full of second Exodus, return from exile stuff. But chapter 1 also has, I'm fed up with your sacrifices, do justice, wash yourselves clean, and that alone, might get you thinking, okay, let's do a water thing and get repentance going. And then there's imagery like Ezekiel's temple, which is sometimes thought of as, a celestial correspondent of the earthly temple rather than a future temple. And from it flows water. And so if you think of the sources of rivers, often are thought of as coming ultimately from heaven, right? Because water comes down from the sky. Then having this connection between heaven and earth through immersion, right, and a connection with celestial atonement or something like that. All of those, I think, are interesting possibilities. In terms of Samuel, one of the things that's a surprisingly neglected topic. So if there are any New Testament scholars or would-be New Testament scholars watching this, it's like, I wish I could come up with something to work on for like a doctoral dissertation. But everything's been done and done and done and done over and over again. John the Baptist as a new Samuel is not something that is really explored, right? In Luke Acts, the story of John is told with echoes of the story of Samuel, right, and his parents, and his sort of miraculous conception, and all of that is echoed in Luke's infancy material. And so it does seem to be depicting John as a figure like Samuel. And of course, Samuel is the one who then anoints the first kings of Israel. And so if he is looking ahead to sort of a royal Messiah, then that would, on the one hand, make him the one who sort of anoints the royal Messiah and appoints that figure. And of course, in ancient Israel, the prophet remained, the ultimate authority, right? There's one who spoke for God, right? You might have a stronger one, right? To use the language that's attributed to John in the Gospels, who'll act with more force, right? Kings tend to do more of the the hacking and slaying and doing that kind of stuff to enemies. But ultimately, the king was thought of as subject to the prophet's authority, right? And so that might have one reason why the early church might have not emphasized that and not done too much with that is precisely that this would suggest that Jesus might be here to show people what's what and sort of do the regime change thing and bring about justice and this, that, and the other. But ultimately, John is the one who decides whether he is or isn't that figure, and who appoints him, and who remains the ultimate authority and spokesperson for God. And so, and obviously, there are all kinds of questions. Did John understand himself in this way? Did all of John's followers understand him this way? Some of them, So it's one reason why I was hesitant to say, yes, look, John is so much easier than historical Jesus. I think in a lot of ways, many of the same issues and questions arise, even if in slightly different ways.
It's funny because my next question kind of points that out with interviews and scholars I've talked to for a long time. The Gospels remember Jesus as beginning his ministry under John's influence. Do you think Jesus was a disciple of John in a formal sense, or more of a participant in his movement? And to add the icing on that, I've interviewed scholars who thought maybe they were not even really connected at all, and someone saw the influence of a Baptist community and thought, let's find a way to merge the movements because they're so narcissism of small differences kind of thing, where, hey, we need to have John nod so our cult grows and we gain John the Baptist followers after John's gone. Anyway, notice any option is possible, but the question is, in your estimation, with your research, do you think that he was under John's influence, like in his ministry, or like in a more formal sense, or just a participant? What are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jesus was an active member of John's movement, and was not just somebody who showed up, got baptized, and then went off back home, but was somebody who got involved in some way. And obviously, we don't have sources that give us a lot of information on that. But one of the things that's fascinating, comparing the Gospel of John and the Synoptic Gospels, is that in the Gospel of John, Jesus meets various figures who are going to eventually become his disciples in the circles around John, right? So they're all there, and this is in, John is not in prison, and in fact, the Gospel of John, implausibly from a historical perspective, but has John saying, all of you should go follow Jesus. He's the Lamb of God, right? And so, but even though this gospel is seeking to do something that's ideologically biased and historically implausible, it's doing so in relation to things that also reflect history, right? And that's the challenge of the historian, is that sometimes even when it's a source is arguing against something, it's telling us what the general impression actually was. Right? And in the prologue of John, right, there's got to be a reason why it's saying he was not the light, right? He just came to bear witness to the light. It's like, oh, interesting. So who thought he was the light that you're insulting this so strongly? Right? But anyway, if we take the Gospel of John with its depiction of Jesus and the sons of Zebedee and various figures encountering one another in the circles around John the Baptist, then when we read the Synoptics and Mark says, after John was put in prison, Jesus came into Galilee and calls these people to follow him, then what we'd understand, if there's some historical basis to both of these, is that Jesus is regrouping John's followers after John's imprisonment, right? He's not starting a new movement. He's not a religious innovator who's just trying to leverage John's fame, although that's not at all implausible, right? It just seems like the evidence is pointing to Jesus having actually had a connection with John. And it seems like one of the reasons why he was able to effectively regroup John's followers and continue John's work while also giving it perhaps a new spin is precisely that there was this existing connection. It's interesting that in the Mandaean book of John, there's a parable about a soul fisher, essentially a fisher for human lives. And it seems like an image that could have been used for John, right? Standing in the water and calling people to, to repent and turn to God. And so when Jesus says, "Come and I'll make you fishers of people," right, according to the Synoptic Gospels, he may have been using an expression that John had already used, right, or that others had been using about John. And I get the impression that when we put these things together, Jesus was essentially saying to them, the movement is not done yet. The work is not done. Come follow me. This is still happening.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'd like to know how, for the public's understanding here, of course, they really need to get this book because it goes in depth. But how do you interpret the tension in the Gospels between Jesus' baptism by John and later attempts to subordinate John's role, like the Gospel of John? I mean, you see something's going on here. There's many different ways to wrestle with this, but how do you deal with it?
As speaking historically, I think that the answer is that Jesus was baptized by John. John was his mentor. He joined John's movement. He said, "Among those born of women, there was none greater than John." And I think he meant it, right? I think he thought that John was the greatest, and that if he either continued John's movement, or even if he served as a sort of Elisha to John's Elijah, right? And so John, like Elijah, is sort of starting the confrontation with the powers, but ultimately, leaves the scene, and Elisha finishes the work. I don't think Elisha would have said that, even if he acted with greater strength and, according to the sources, had a double portion of Elijah's spirit, but it's Elijah's spirit. Right? I think that Jesus saw himself as part of something that John had started. And I think that when we read the sources closely, they either say that or they're struggling really hard to give a different impression than that, because that's awkward. But even so, they can't denigrate John too much, because Jesus held him in such high esteem, right? Which is part of the fascinating situation.
Interesting. Do you think the historical Jesus would have continued John's message, or did he intentionally reshape it into something distinct in your view?
That's a sort of the $1 million question. And part of it, so we end up with the Mandaeans accusing Jesus of distorting John's teaching and his baptism. But it's fascinating to look at what they accuse Jesus of. It's baptizing in cut-off water, in other words, non-flowing water, which Christians, of course, do end up embracing, right? Having baptismal fonts in churches and things like that. And then, cutting off, seed from men and, procreation. And so monasticism. And again, so how much of this is Jesus's fault and how much of this is what emerges, in the circles around Jesus, right? There are some places in the Gospels where we might see innovation, but it's not entirely clear. So, for instance, when Jesus pronounced sins forgiven, did he baptize people? And it doesn't say explicitly, but it doesn't explicitly say he doesn't, right? By the time we get to the Gospel of John, though, there's this man lying right by an immersion pool, right? And he wants to get into the pool, and then Jesus heals him. And so is this indicating that Jesus was pronouncing sins forgiven without baptizing? Or was he maybe using water, but if you had a paralyzed person who couldn't easily be immersed, then sprinkling was fine. The Didache, right, that early Christian source, says use cold flowing water if available. If not, warm water will do. And says if none of those are available, then you can pour 3 times. And so what we see happening is that Christianity develops a greater willingness to be flexible on the mode of administration of baptism, and Mandaeism is adamant no. And so here again, it's the question: how do we see back behind these debates between these two traditions influenced by John? Right. How much of this goes back to Jesus?
That's actually in my next question. You devote a significant space to Mandean traditions, which preserve John as a central figure, like Christianity does for Jesus. But what do you think these sources can tell us about the historical Baptist, if anything? Yeah,
so I use them. I use them with a great deal of caution. these are sources, for those who might be interested, that were at one point given a lot of attention by New Testament scholars. So first half of the 20th century, up until around the middle of the 20th century, there was a widely held view that essentially the Mandaean sources are the background to the Gospel of John, right? And that this is what John's Gospel is arguing against. That view was becoming surprisingly popular. And there was a backlash against it because the sources are later and the Mandaean sources are later. And on the one hand, absolutely fair, that there should have been a backlash because you can't just plug in sources from centuries later as background, right? It was the same issue with plugging in the Talmud as though it's the context of Jesus, right? Mm-hmm. And yet, as with the Talmud and with the Mishnah, they're later, but sometimes they do have things that reflect earlier tradition, even if it's in a developed form, and we need to do historical critical study on it. The analogy I use in the book is that if we didn't have any of the New Testament Gospels, and all we had was like Josephus' brief mention, then we had the Nag Hammadi stuff, we'd be able to do some historical study of that and realize that behind these sources, there probably is some earlier tradition. And we know that to be the case because we can compare them to the Gospels. And the Gospel of Thomas alone is full of a lot of the sayings that also show up in the Synoptics. And so I do think that Mandaean sources have embedded within them some things that are ancient and useful. They are not contemporaneous, and so they need to be studied critically. And I really hope there will be more of that because there's been use and then neglect of Mandaean sources by those who are interested in the New Testament and early Christianity. There hasn't been extensive historical critical study of Mandaean sources to say, okay, what's tradition, what's redaction? Does any of this go back to the historical John and those kinds of questions? And so it became one chapter in that book. I think I mentioned in the book that at one point I thought that I should ditch the idea of writing one book and just make each of those chapter topics into a book of its own. But I then quickly realized that nobody at the moment wanted like a multi-volume set about John the Baptist with that level of detail. And so I said, okay, I'll write this and hopefully we'll get more, maybe myself, as in the coming years, but if others want to step into this and take on any of these topics, each of them is deserving of more attention.
Yeah, I'd love to see more on this. There's also, as you know, some early Christian writers linked John with figures like Josephus and Simon Magus, seeing him at the roots of Gnosticism. Do you find that connection persuasive? And keep that one in mind. But for the audience, there's a commentary on John, and I can't remember which early father it was in particular. Might have been like Clement or Origen or one of these guys. In the commentary, they talked about Dositheans and the leader Dositheos actually dying, or they believe some people thought he died, but he didn't die. They said he's still alive to this day. It's in one of the commentaries, and I was like, it's so awesome to find because there's a belief with another cult, like a similar, parallel kind of movement that believed their guy was still alive. And they're writing this, the movement still believes this hundreds of years after the first century. This guy was running around supposedly around the time Simon Magus and John the Baptist were on the scene with Jesus and stuff like that. Anyway, derailed from the initial topic, but do you think there's something to the Simon Magus, Dositheos, John the Baptist stuff?
I do. And, it's just these threads that no one seems to have been forcing to connect, but when you start pulling on each of them, they seem to lead to the sort of same place. So we get the pseudo-Clementine literature, right? That fascinating Jewish Christian literature, basically viewing John negatively, right? It's like the only Christian source that just bites the bullet and says, no, John is a problem, right? And we got to just denigrate him outright. But views, there are quite a number of sources that say that Simon Magus is, Simon of Samaria is the one who was sort of the original Gnostic, right? Who did this. And what the pseudo-Clementines bring into the picture is that both Simon and Dositheus have a connection with John. And so between the Mandaeans and that, someone could make the case, it's like, so was John a Gnostic? I'm not persuaded that John was a Gnostic, but John must have been the kind of teacher, the kind of figure around whom you could have movements emerge as diverse as conservative Jewish Christianity, Gnosticism, and some other ones, right?
I think this is the one. So this is Origin, I believe, and it says, sorry to interrupt, but this is powerful point. Yeah, we must also consider the statement, when he comes, he will tell us all things. Did the Samaritan woman say this from tradition? Notice it's a commentary on the Gospel of John. So here we are, John stuff, right? We must not fail to remark, however, that just as Jesus arose from among the Jews, not only saying that he was Christ, but also demonstrating it, so also a certain Josephus arose from among the Samaritans and declared that he himself was the Christ who had been prophesied. To this day, there are Josephus derived from him who bring forward books of Josephus and certain stories about him describing how he did not taste death, but is alive somewhere. But this is enough on the literal sense. So
no, it's not enough. Tell us more.
No, we need more.
I'd forgotten about that. I should have probably worked in a reference to that in the book.
If you need this, I could send this to you, by the way, and just add it to an article or something if you want to. Yeah,
I mean, it's another one of the topics that I definitely will be doing more on is Josephus and that. So among the Samaritans, we also have references to a Dustan sect, right? So in Samaritan literature, right? Wow. And Dustan sounds like Dosithian, right? And one of their characteristics was they would pray standing in water. Right? Theodore Barconi, right, Syriac Christian author in Mesopotamia in the, I want to say 10th century, is the first Christian to quote Mandaean texts. He doesn't know them as Mandaeans, though, and he uses other names for them, but one of the names that he uses for them is Dosthians, right? And so the possibility that the Mandaeans are essentially the continuation of this tradition is one that, again, needs a lot more attention that's been given by scholars.
That's why I'm thankful that you're the one chipping away at this. Hopefully you're the John the Baptist of something bigger, right? And
yeah. I hope a stronger one will come after me and solve all the problems.
Now, would you be worthy, the question is, of unbuckling their sandal? That's the real question we need to know. I'd
give it a shot.
Attempt, at least try, but you're not claiming to be the light, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm not. I think both John and Jesus were humble. It's like, he's the greatest person who ever lived. I'm not worthy to untie his sandal. It's like, maybe they both were remembered as being humble.
I probably would never say that,
By the way, I really want somebody to work on this. Not worthy to untie the sandal. That is like ridiculously specific, right? What's the story behind that? And John seems to have used a lot of colorful imagery. Was there something that he did? Did he wear sandals? Does that have anything to do with it? I don't know, but there's something fascinating about this, right? I mean, if I say, Derek of MythVision is so great that I'm not worthy to untie the laces of his athletic shoes. I mean, and there were no prior, saying in the Gospels about this. You'd be like, what? That's like a weird thing to say, James. Like, where's that coming from? Right. And I think we've become so familiar with the image in the New Testament that we don't realize how weird it is.
Yeah. I don't know. I could even see it being kind of like, today we have sayings that are kind of like, I'm not worthy at all. Yeah. But it clearly wasn't mentioned in the earlier Gospels, which makes it odd. But what if it was just, I don't know what you would call that technically, but a statement that is exaggerative, but meant to intentionally point out the superiority of someone else or to something else. You know what I mean?
Yeah. But it seems like there are other ways you could say that, right? I mean, and so we don't have, like, if we had a source that said very, very clearly that, just something about sandals and sandal removal and things like that. There is one thing in the rabbinic literature that mentions about, a disciple untying a sandal. But it's this seems like something that people were supposed to understand, right?
And so this might be inside language that we're not accustomed to.
Yeah.
The other thing, it's the opposite. But you know how we'll say, I wouldn't touch them with a 10-foot pole. You know, like the way we would look at someone we don't want to touch, right? I don't like this person or that person. A quick way of saying is I wouldn't touch them with a 100-foot pole or a 10-foot pole. Kind of wondered if it was the saying, but maybe there's some Jewish custom here or something that.
Yeah, it could be alluding to something, right? If I go, we're not worthy, right? Then people who know the movie will know what I'm talking about, and other people will be like, what was that?
Yeah, what just happened? Baptism as a central role in both what we would say Christianity and Gnostic traditions. Why did this one ritual pioneered by John take on such wide-reaching influence? I guess another way to ask is, was this an exclusive practice from your estimation? Because I thought I read somewhere that there was baptism in mystery cults as well. So is this becoming a Hellenistic thing to do these kinds of things? But this is its Jewish kind of, it's got its own Jewish avenue, but there's like a common thing. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, a great question. And the use of water, and immersion is something that's widespread, right? We have it for purity, and so if it's happening in the mystery cult, the next question is there a direct influence? And then if there's a direct influence, in which direction is it, right?
Right.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is really fascinating is, I wondered, having been to India a couple of times and having seen the immersion practice in the Ganges, I wondered, could that have traveled along the Silk Road and come to the Levant and been an influence on either the purity immersion practices or on John? And as I asked people who work on Hinduism and South Asian tradition, what I discovered is that the immersion practices there don't seem to really become a focus, don't become a thing until like the Middle Ages. And by that point, we know that there were Mandaeans, Elkosites, others that were in Mesopotamia and Parthia, and so basically right at the border with what's now India. And so could it be that baptizing movements from influenced by John influenced Hindu immersion rather than vice versa? I mean, it's one of those things that makes me think just how widespread was John's influence. Manichaeism reaches he rejects baptism after having a powerful religious experience in the context of immersion in water, but perhaps precisely to make sure that nobody else claims his kind of authority, then says, we're doing away with that. But then Manichaeism gets as far as China, right? But his start in the Elkosites, who are influenced presumably again, as perhaps a Christian group that are closer to John and his focus, because they do more immersion and do different immersion, have more of a focus on that than other Christians do. And so there too, we've got John's influence reaching China. So.
It's so interesting. Couple more for me, and then we'll get to super chats. If we recenter John as a pivotal figure in the emergence of Christianity, how does that change the story of Christian origins, in your opinion?
I think, to use an analogy, right? If we started with Paul and didn't get the sense that, we really need to focus on Jesus in order to make sense of Paul, because Paul understands himself to be part of something bigger that goes back to before him, then we'd misunderstand Paul, right? And there's no real danger of that because Paul is so Jesus focused. But Jesus is John focused, right? I mean, he's in the Gospels, when he's challenged in his authority to do his action in the temple, according to the Synoptic Gospels again, he says, okay, you asked by what authority I do this? Let me ask you one question. John's baptism, was it from heaven or from human beings? Right? And so he links he responds to their question about his authority by asking them a question about John's authority. And Jesus doesn't connect himself with any other figure in that way. Even when there's some sort of contrast related to eating habits, and oftentimes people have made too much of this, I think, because we have no record that John said, be baptized for the forgiveness of sins and eat locusts and wild honey. But Jesus clearly had some sort of different dining habits, and so you get that John came neither eating nor drinking, and you didn't accept him. Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say, he's a rebellious son. The point is they're responding to these two figures who are linked, right? And without who, you can't understand one correctly without the other in Jesus' view. But, you might be able to understand John, but you can't understand Jesus without John, right? I mean, John is there first doing the thing, and then Jesus is coming along and taking a different tack in some ways and approaching things somewhat differently, but still doing the John thing. And so I think that, and I don't claim to offer this fully in my books, but I hope I've gotten the process started. I think there are going to be lots of longstanding puzzles and mysteries related to early Christian literature, where if we start with John and go back to John and then look at what's happening here, then we'll be able to at least get some greater clarity on them and figure some of them out.
It seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you think John deserves to be remembered not just as a forerunner of Jesus, but as a founder in his own right of religious traditions that stretched far beyond Christianity.
Yeah, I would say that's absolutely true. And we see in the history of religion, you can see it in the history of like denominations and things like that. That sometimes, the person who really starts the tradition, may not be the one who gets remembered, right? Some of the earliest figures who are challenging Catholic authority didn't become the ones that were the ones who were remembered and got a church named after them, right? Luther wasn't the first to do so, right? But he gets remembered. Look at the history of something like Methodism or things like that. All of them. There's this, after either the death of the founder or after some crisis emerges, then you get this splintering. And sometimes one of the things that splinters off becomes a big thing that becomes a focus. And unless you look into the history, you might not realize how much something that happened earlier and that was huge in that particular time period was responsible for this thing.
Right. That's why it's so much that needs to be reconsidered. So my final question is, what do you hope readers and viewers here will take away about John the Baptist that they have never really considered before?
Well, I think we've mentioned quite a few of them. The one thing I will mention is that I hope that readers, unless they are very, well, not even just if they're not very into like nitty-gritty academic detail that not everybody finds fascinating, but also if you want to, a place to start. I wrote a second book called Christmaker, A Life of John the Baptist, because I wanted to do the digging into the details. Can we use Mandaean sources? John the Baptist in Q, those kinds of things. But I also wanted to answer the question that of how do these pieces fit together, right? So what happens if you try to tell the story of the life of this figure? Can we even do it, right? And there are some who've said it's impossible. I tried. You may read what I tried to do and say, yep, nope, the critics were right. It's impossible. His attempt shows that. But it's the same thing that sometimes happens with historical Jesus studies, that sometimes someone will do this really important study of this one particular saying, and it's like, okay, that's great. How does that fit into the big picture? What else do I need to rethink in relation to that? And so I wanted to do the general audience thing and the scholarly thing separately for a change. I wanted to do the putting the pieces together thing, but also, okay, some of these pieces really need attention. But I think of the various things we mentioned, one that I hope people will take a peek at is just find out about the Mandaeans, right? Because they are fascinating, right? I'm guessing that a lot of people who are some of your biggest fans think Gnosticism is fascinating.
Yeah.
And if you've never, you've read Nag Hammadi texts because you thought they're interesting, and it mentions some sort of baptism and mentions the rituals and the crown and the anointing and things like that, the Mandaeans are still around and they're still practicing this. They may not be doing what 3rd century Gnostics were doing, but their traditions certainly go back, a very, very long way. And so there's a connection at least. And so it's something like that. And so get on YouTube, right? After you're done watching this, get on YouTube, type in Mandaean baptism and take a look at this, right? Because I think that's just fascinating. And the scholars can debate, is this something that sheds light on John the Baptist? Do Mandaeans keep things from John that Christians didn't? Did they preserve certain things more accurately than Christians did? Those historical questions are important. But what I will say is that the very existence of this tradition and the very things that they do, like multiple baptism, right? So it's a repeated rite, right? You do it more than once because you need to be forgiven for sins more than once. The possibility that that's what John did is worth considering. Would have been worth considering as a possibility even without the Mandaeans, but the fact that this group that claims to preserve tradition from John does this makes it all the more important that scholars asking about John's baptism consider such possibilities.
Before I get to Q&A, did I tell you that I was baptized in the Jordan River?
No.
In the name of MythVision, I went in. I kid you not. We went on a tour with James Tabor and me, Neil from Gnostic Informant, my wife. We went in and I baptized Neil in I was looking around. There's so many like fundamentalists you can tell that are like down there. Now it's a beautiful, awesome experience. It's fun. I don't care how. I don't care. I had a blast. I did a kind of a MythVision baptism though, in the name of MythVision, and I dunked Neil on camera. I did it with my wife too. And while our feet were in the water, if you've ever been in it, I'm sure you know, little fish are like nibbling on your toes, and it's like, what the hell's going on down there? Anyway, it was really cool.
So were you at Qasr al-Yahud, like the traditional site, like the sort of near getting close to the Dead Sea, or were you the one in Galilee, Yardenit, with the convenient steps and rails and stuff?
The steps and rails, and I think it was closer to being somewhere up north more than it was going down south.
Yeah. So that's a fascinating site. I could get into lots of stuff about there.
I could tell you this too. I kid you not, a solar eclipse happened as I baptized. I'm not making this up.
I'll tell you what. I wish I had a photograph of this. So I was at the Jordan. I took students there, and a white pigeon, basically a white dove, flew over my head. It didn't land on it. It didn't like hover there and a beam of sunlight from the sky. But still, I wish that a student had their camera ready and captured the that would have just been like, that would have been my permanent profile picture, I think.
Oh, seriously?
Right?
No, it was awesome. I found out after, because it wasn't a complete solar eclipse, so it shaded for a moment, but it wasn't a full solar eclipse. And we found out that at the very moment I baptized them in the name of MythVision and got baptized, and that there was an eclipse. So I don't know if that's an omen of damnation or an omen of good fortune, but I'll just say whatever. It's
impressive one way or the other.
Either way, I'm like, you know what, man, this is good. Enough about me and enough of my questions. Time to turn to the audience here. We got Solera Knight in the house. Thank you for being a member, for showing love and support. Solera asks, there are over 10,000 religions worldwide. How do other religions deal with this flawed original sin thing that would pledge all humankind, all humankind if true?
Yeah, and thank you for figuring out what the autocorrect did there. Otherwise we're going to, might have given the wrong spin on it. So not only do other religions not do the original sin thing, but not even all Christianity does it. Although, because Augustine has had an influence that's even gotten into Protestantism, it's there. But if you go to Jewish tradition, it's not there. And so a lot of religion are not worried about original sin. Some of them will just say, just do the right thing. Just get your act together. There often is a recognition that there is an instinct within us that doesn't always tend towards what is good and right. But for instance, one of my favorite non-Christian treatments of this is where the rabbis discuss what they call the good impulse and the evil impulse. And they recognize, at least some of them did, that the so-called evil impulse, right, is the impulse to procreate and to feed oneself and to survive. and that it's only when that is sort of not balanced by other impulses and taken to an extreme that it leads to harm. And so, I'm much more inclined to go the Jedi way and strive for balance.
That's interesting. You could see if you took an angle like me who doesn't think ontologically that divine fingers are involved, you can see even just naturally how humans would observe these behaviors and realize philosophies from the east to the west that are saying we should stop the sexual stuff, we should stop the indulging, like overeating, all of these things. So there's all sorts of ways in which I think these things would naturally arise, but they still have power, they still have good meaning. I mean, I catch myself all the time thinking about death, and I'm like, it's a freaky thing to think about. And I think to myself, you know what really I think bothers me the most lately in my thinking about just death itself is that I helped create 3 kids that are now going to they're going to have great memories, they're going to have great experiences, but they're also they're now in this body, and they are going to have to experience pain, and they're going to have to die one day too. So I feel bad now, but I didn't realize that, I was a young kid, but I'm just thinking to myself, like, yeah, death sucks, anyway.
Yeah. And a lot of religion is can be summed up, why is this religion, why did this religion develop? Death sucks.
Death sucks. Makes sense. Doc Paloroma, not always with his inquisitive questions, and lives near me. Thank you so much for being a super chat member of the whole nine. Given Acts 19 and Mandean tradition, isn't the prologue's insistence that John was not the light evidence of active competition over revelatory status? Yes.
So I think that there was, and so, as per our discussion earlier, the key question is, did Jesus ever become a competitor of John? Right? And it's interesting that, in the Gospel of John, you have John's followers complaining that everybody's going after Jesus. And John saying, hey, I told you he's supposed to increase and I'm supposed to decrease. But that's really weird, because why is John still doing his thing and having followers if they're all supposed to be going after Jesus? And so my impression is that that's a later perspective, right? That's, weaving into an account of the life of Jesus, some of these issues that were later concerned. But there too, what the author is trying to do is make John the mouthpiece of, oh yeah, if were John's follower, go after Jesus. And plenty of John's followers thought, John had it all. We don't need Jesus. And especially after he was crucified, it's like, yeah, maybe he wasn't the one who is to come, right? Stronger one, that's not what we're expecting, right? And so I think that all those things are the things that Christians, other followers of John the Baptist, were wrestling with.
Yeah, and I think there's the way you're viewing it has more consistent, it seems more smooth thinking that way, because I have heard some suggest, no, there are 2 different cults from the get-go. They're competing. And so to win over the John the Baptist audience, you craft narratives where your guy is kind of, working along with him. They're just another way to explain it just seems a little bit more like, why would you in Mark? Because it's obvious Mark didn't have a problem with this. Yeah. It's once you get to Matthew, Luke, and John that you start seeing, damn, John wants to erase the whole picture of him actually being baptized. Luke and Matthew, you can tell, are not fans of what's going on here to some degree. Mark's like, yeah, he was baptized and he was for the forgiveness of sins, and he was right there with John. John's his leader, the whole nine.
Yeah. I mean, I think one possible explanation for that, right, is that, at the earliest stage, there were followers of Jesus who thought, this is going to be the future of John's movement. Jesus is going to be the future of John's movement. And after the crucifixion, the impact of whatever kinds of religious experiences they had or whatever persuaded them that Jesus had been vindicated beyond death, they're like, no, this works. This makes sense of how he can, this could happen, and yet he could still be the one who is to come. I think that's what's happening in a lot of the sort of Son of Man sayings, is that you have, it's wrestling with the question, how can Jesus be the one John predicted and yet not have judged judged the world and brought justice and so on and so forth. And the early Christians were saying, he's going to. And it's probably when other branches of the John movement, which many of John's followers may have been like, oh yeah, Jesus is going to be the one. And then at the crucifixion, they're like, oh well. And now you have a John movement that's both perhaps other people are emerging from it as leaders and possible fulfillments of John's predictions, but also just like, we don't need that. I'm sure there were some who were saying, John, talking about one who's going to come, Son of Man, who will come, was probably talking about himself. And God will vindicate John and bring back John. John will come back. And so what we probably get as the tradition develops is a sense that the John movement is actually flourishing and is a genuine competitor to this Christian thing.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Doc, for that. Victor Engelman, thanks for the super chat, my friend. Question: who was beheaded? Their head put on a plate and given as present to the bride at a wedding?
I'm not sure, because it sounds almost like the story of Herod Antipas's birthday, right? And the head is given to the daughter or stepdaughter Herodias after she dances and requests it. I am suspicious of that story, right? It's one of those things where that's this very vivid story, but there's so much that's derivative in it, and we don't know that they would have had any sources inside the palace to provide this information. Plus, there's always this effort, right? Mark is the first to tell this story, and he seems eager both to deflect blame for John's death away from Herod Antipas and to deflect blame for Jesus' death away from Romans. And so, yeah, but I'm not sure if that's a question about, Medusa. Okay, so.
Yeah, so I suspect Victor might be considering whether or not there is some earlier Greek template. Yeah. I know I'll tell you this, there is a scholar who wrote a book on Greek myth and Homer's Odyssey in the Old Testament, but he also covers New Testament examples. And he thinks that the platter scene with John clearly contradicts Josephus in many aspects, he said. But, it's a story. John's obviously doing a story with it. Mark's doing a story with John. But there's a myth in Roman mythology we have in Ovid that has a story of the sun god, and I can't remember names here, but his son comes and he questions his pedigree as a son. And so he says to his dad, like, I don't think I'm your child. And the dad's like, no, you are. Listen, ask me for anything. I vow, which is where he screwed up. I swear anything you ask for, I will give it to you, which is exactly what Mark says, where Herod tells his daughter, listen, ask for anything and I will give it to you. He can't go back on his word. Well, the son asked for his chariot, and the dad knew that was not a good idea. And so he's like, listen, you don't know how to steer this thing. You get too close to the earth, you're going to burn up the earth. You get too high, it's going to freeze, all of this stuff. And the son insists, but because he vowed he has to do it, well, it ends up being a chaotic myth that ends up bad. Well, he thinks there's something going on between that myth and at least as a trope, there's some kind of trope that's being utilized by Mark, he thinks, in the John the Baptist myth. I'd
be interested to know whether that, what the order of, influence is, or whether this is just one of these literary tropes that, you don't have to have seen all the other instances of it in order to pick it up somewhere. Because we also get, almost the exact phrase. It might, in the Septuagint, it might be the exact phrase. I'd have to check. In the story of Esther, that Xerxes says, ask me anything up to half my kingdom, right? And the phrase seems to be borrowed from there because, one of the things that you should know about Herod Antipas is he didn't have a kingdom. Right. So he did not have the title king, and yet Mark gets that wrong. So there's all kinds of issues with Mark's story.
Yeah. And the fact the language sounds incestual too. So it's a great way to make Herod look like a terrible, terrible person. He has his daughter dancing in front of him and his men, like in a sexual way. that's a huge red flag. The way that the language was is what the scholar was saying is like, this is not looking good for Herod. And the mom insisted. It's like, oh, you got a weird family going on. Anyway, Doc Pleroma, not again. Thank you so much, Doc. Since Josephus says Herod feared John's crowds, doesn't that make John the true revolutionary? While Jesus was later rebranded into Rome's safe theology, it tamed echo of John's apocalyptic politics.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The apocalypticism, is also, not there in, sort of the Gnostic John the Baptist tradition of the Mandaeans. And so I think the fading of apocalypticism, a lot of that just, was perhaps inevitable, although it keeps resurfacing in Christianity, but that some, the passage of time and these things not happening would lead to a different sort of focus. And whether that makes things Rome safe. I mean, the Romans certainly, didn't view Christians favorably and viewed their teaching and their practices as subversive. But I'm less persuaded that Jesus was, as a historical figure, was less of an apocalypticist than John was. I think they both were anticipating these things, and it's coping with the fact that Jesus doesn't bring the end about and the ongoing passage of time that we get the diminution, the downplaying of the apocalyptic element.
To add to this question, do you think that if John didn't die, he would have been the one cleansing or attempting to cleanse the temple, like Judas the Galilean?
Maybe. I mean, I think Jesus did his action in the temple at John's behest, right? And the Gospel of John says that Jesus carried that out before John was put in prison. Which I think
that's right.
Right. And so, and if John's immersion would have been a threat, not a threat to the physical structure of the temple, but to sacrifice and its centrality, And so I think this was a symbolic action that expressed what John was about. And I mean, we could only speculate. And I don't want to try and do fan fiction on the spot, but I would love, I think it would be fascinating to write the alternative history where John doesn't die and see what would happen.
Interesting. Thank you so much for that. S Mill in the house. Thank you for the super chat, S Mill. Eugnostos, I don't know if I'm saying that right.
Eugnostos the Blessed, Elkasite. So I'm not persuaded that the is anything that's distinctive of the Essenes. Not everything that was found at Qumran was, but I don't see a direct connection between the Essenes and John. We see similarities between Jesus and the Pharisees, but ultimately the differences are as important, if not more important, than the similarities. Right. And so, even if there are some points of intersection, I think the differences are more important. But I do think that the Elkasites, in particular, and some other things that we see in both the Judaism and the Christianity of the early period, are closer to and reflect aspects of John's influence that we might not recognize as such because the influence is not flowing through literature that we have, right? And so, John's impact was broader, right? And a lot of it was being passed on orally and culturally. And so I do think that in particular, the Elkasites deserve more attention as, again, there needs to be a comparative study of baptism, trying to triangulate back from all the different forms of baptism in all these different branches of Christianity and in Mandaeism and in other places, and say, can we use all of them, do a comparative study that would help us bring what John actually did into clearer focus.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Victor Engelman, next super chat. Thank you again. Is John Oannes the Babylonian fish god of wisdom?
No.
Do you think there's any possible relationships between this or somehow?
Yeah, I'm gonna stick with no. I mean, there are lots of names and words that sound similar, and I
got you.
I don't think there's any connection.
Gotcha. Thank you so much, Victor. I imagine if you were to potentially look for something, maybe go to Jonah more. Jonah might have something closer, especially with Jonah centrally aimed at Nineveh, right? So it's geographically intentionally aiming at a targeted people who Oannes was a known god for. You know what I mean?
That I love, right? Jonah as an attempt to take a dig at the Babylonian fish. Yeah.
But just because John is associated with water and has wisdom, of course, that he's teaching and stuff, doesn't necessarily, you're not seeing any connection between.
I'm not open to being persuaded. Victor should feel free to send me the email, and I'll always happy to think of possibilities I might have not given due consideration, but not seeing it.
Gotcha. Doc Pleuromonad again says, last one, and thanks, Doc, for all the support. If Luke has John's spirit filled from the womb, and Jesus only receives it at baptism, doesn't that suggest the spirit passes from John to Jesus, subordination the Gospels later had to mask?
Yes, absolutely. The Acts is so implausible when Paul. So first of all, the thing to note is that John's movement and his baptism reach Ephesus in Asia Minor before the Christian version of this thing does, right? So Paul arrives there and is preaching the gospel, and he finds disciples there who've been baptized with John's baptism. And then when he asks, have you received the Holy Spirit? They say, we don't even know there is a Holy Spirit, right? And that's just so implausible, so just polemical, making them seem like they don't have a connection with the Spirit. But earlier in Acts, Luke said that John was filled with the Spirit from the womb, and John's baptism did bestow the Holy Spirit on someone, Jesus, right? And so, absolutely, there's this attempt to subordinate John and his baptism to Jesus and to Christian baptism. Absolutely.
Is this kind of a proto version in Luke of what they did to Mary eventually too? Because, she was normal, got pregnant, God, of course, this is a miraculous birth we find in Luke and Matthew, but, she goes back and sleeps with Joseph and stuff. Then they had to find ways where they're like, no, Mary was born sinless. Okay, we've got to make sense of how this came to be, because imagine as they theologize the movement, by the time Luke's writing, who knows when, late first, sometime in the second, and they're going, hold on, a mundane man, born of a man and a woman, typical human, is baptizing and the Spirit falls upon the Christ. We need this guy to have had some miraculous initiation early on where, he's significant enough. What are your thoughts? I mean, does that make sense to kind of...
Yeah. And I think the question of, we didn't get into this, and I definitely don't want to get into this now. We're sort of trying to wrap up the episode. But the possibility that in that early work known as the Infancy Gospel of James, that's elevating Mary, in this way and making her a focus of attention, I think it may be reworking things that were about the Baptist and his parents. Mm-hmm. And so it may be that some of the attention that's given to Mary as essentially Jesus's forerunner, right, in a sense, is to sort of make someone other than John the focus as an effort to address his apparent centrality.
Interesting observation. So Lara Knight, thank you for the super chat. What is the main difference about the Southern Baptist than other Christian denominations?
And they're not entirely different than others. Being connected with American Baptists myself, I just never miss an opportunity to say that the Southern Baptists broke away from the larger American Baptist Union because the Southern Baptists wanted to keep their slaves. They have since shifted from that position, but the way they interpret the scriptures reflects the same tradition of, inerrancy and things like that, which is never consistent, but is used to keep women out of ministry is one of the things they now focus on. There are other things we could talk about.
Thank you, Solera. And then last one, S. Mill in the house. Thank you for the super chat. Mandeans starting in Babylonia or Jordan River, before, after 70 of the Common Era, and how does Jesus, the B-man, fit?
John the B-man.
John, sorry.
Yeah, which I guess is the Baptist man.
Yeah.
I need to see what AI can come up with. John the Baptist is a superhero, Baptist man. But yeah, I mean, so it's a historical question that, their scholars have different views on. Do the Mandaeans, are they at least somewhat independent of John, and then maybe the John stuff gets into them after there is already a thing, and it's a merging of two traditions? How much of it stems from John? I mean, I think the most likely scenario, given what we get, and there's some articles of mine that people can look up, some of which are available online, exploring this question of Mandaean history. I think that the most likely explanation is that we get a group, a Jewish, or I'd call it an Israelite group, because it might be Samaritan, right? It might be other tribes than Judah, but somehow connected with ancient Israelite tradition that intersects with John and his movement and develops into what we know of as Gnosticism, and quite possibly, after the fall of Jerusalem, perhaps even earlier, but at least then, you get people moving elsewhere, and of course, there's a significant Jewish community and a significant Israelite diaspora in Mesopotamia, and so moving there, and probably in that context remaining as sort of a secret society, like a mystical group with esoteric teachings within the context of a Jewish community, and then eventually sort of breaking away as what they believe was discovered. If they don't like Jesus, they also don't like the Jewish creator God, as is typical of Gnosticism. And so, once that comes out, it's going to be like, yeah, we don't want you coming to our synagogue anymore. But all of this is very, very hard to pin down. But it's hard for me to explain the focus on John and the kinds of things that we get there, or the focus on Jerusalem that you get in Mandaean tradition, if it's something that emerges in Mesopotamia as its starting place.
Thank you so much. Hey, everybody, thank you for being supportive. Memberships, super chats help keep our lights on, of course. We really appreciate that. And thank you for your time. Dr. McGrath, let's do this again. I hope I wasn't going way too deep into some of this stuff. I think there's so much more to learn, of course.
Oh no, I love it when somebody goes deep into it. I've had quite a few conversations that were just skimming the surface, and so the fact that you wanted to dig into the details was just wonderful. Thank you. You know me. I love this stuff. So I really appreciate your time and energy. Any final words from you to the audience? Just if you read Christmaker and or John of History Baptist of Faith, and you have further questions, I have a blog. I'm active on social media, and so love even finding out that somebody really just appreciated and valued something you wrote is really meaningful to authors. And I think sometimes readers don't realize how much that encouragement means. But if you were like, oh, I don't buy this, what about this thing? Those kinds of questions are also sometimes generative and can lead on to other projects. So always happy to hear from readers.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, get a copy of the book for yourself. I hope you will, and I thank you. I hope that everybody never forgets, we are MythVision.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.